Well, the Bible provides us with important anchor points over which things were going on. We've got the events of Creation Week, the events of the fall, we've got the events of the flood, and the events of the post-flood world. But they're very sketchy details. I mean, when we think about it, all of this history, which spans more than 1,600 years, 1,700 years, is in just about 8 chapters. Right? And most of that is in 1 chapter worth of genealogies that skips through all the time until then. So as important as the biblical framework is for us in providing us with key points in which to build our hypotheses and ideas, the only way to get a lot of the answers is to go to the rocks. You've got to go to the fossil record, you've got to go to the rocks, you've got to go to biology, you've got to go to the different disciplines of science to tease out the details that God hasn't seen fit to tell us directly in His Word, because that's not the point of the biblical record. The biblical record's point is to tell us what has happened and why we're in the state that we're in. Why is it that the world is the mess that it is in? Now, the events of creation geologically are really interesting because God's forming the basic materials of the world. The making of the continents. On day 3, we call this the great upheaval, as God raises the land up out of the sea. There must be profound geological activity going on, not only in the formation of rock, but of granites and metamorphic rocks, but also all the erosions creating huge amounts of non-fossil bearing sedimentary rocks. You saw some of those in the Grand Canyon.
Yes, right.
There are sedimentary rocks below the unconformity, but they don't have animal fossils in them. So that makes sense that they would belong in a Creation Week setting.
Do you think this is part of what we read in Peter when he's talking about how God formed the earth by water and through water? So it's almost as if he was using the actions of water in the very beginning.
Yeah, from day 1 in Creation Week, we find that God said He created the heavens and the earth was without form, it was void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, right? It was basically a watery ball of mush that hasn't yet been organized into something that could support life. And so day 2, God separates the waters so that now we have a distinction between atmospheric waters and waters on the earth itself. And day 3, God then pulls the land up out of the waters in order to create continents versus oceans, and finally calls them seas because they're now organized and distinct from the land. So yeah, Peter is definitely pulling back from that in order to get the imagery to remind us that the world was created with water.
Yes.
And that by those waters, as Peter says, the world was then deluged and destroyed. So this gives us a clue. It's one of those few points in the Bible that gives us a little bit of a clue that it's the waters of the world that destroyed the world at the time of the flood, and brought us to a point at the pinnacle of the flood story where it says, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days, and only Noah was left and those who were with him on the ark. The world is brought back to the same state at the middle of the flood that it was at the beginning of creation. It's this watery ball of unformedness with chaos going underneath as animals are being destroyed and buried and turned into fossils. But that's part of the whole point. God is resetting the world using Noah as a fresh representative of the human race like Adam. He's preserving the animals. He's not going to remake them. God's not in the business of recreating the world after the flood. So we see the flood narrative pulls a lot from what's going on in Creation Week, but it does so in an interesting way. Mark Twain's rumored to have said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And what we see is a thematic continuity in the Bible between how the world was formed and how it is reshaped by the flood.
Well, are there other clues in that Genesis history that helps us understand exactly how God then destroyed the earth?
Yeah, the first clue comes in Genesis chapter 6, in the prelude to the flood itself, when God says, "Behold, I am going to destroy the earth with the earth." Now, as a geologist, that's tantalizing. I mean, I'm not entirely sure what that phrase means, but God destroying the world with the earth means that the earth is complicit in some way, that God is directing the planet to destroy itself.
So he may not speak in some supernatural way, which he could, but it sounds like he's going to use that which is already there.
That's right. There's certainly a supernatural component to the flood. It wouldn't have happened without God's divine command for this to occur. But nevertheless, God is also using the material components of the earth to do the flood itself. So we don't have some miraculous source of water for the flood. The water for the flood is the same waters that actually we still have around us today. The waters from the ocean were pushed over the continents by a variety of different tectonic activities. Now, tectonics for a geologist is simply a fancy way of saying when rocks move. rocks of the crust, the continental crust, but also the ocean crust. Over the past couple of decades, creation geologists have been working up and trying to tune a concept called catastrophic plate tectonics. Now, we learn about plate tectonics in high school and maybe in college if you take a class in geology or earth science. And today, the plates, the ocean and the continental crust material, move fairly slowly, a few centimeters a year. But if catastrophic plate tectonics is correct, then the movements of those plates actually was happening very, very quickly and is the mechanism by which the flood occurred.
Do you think that's the first thing that happened?
Yeah, that as the fountains of the great deep broke apart and the windows of heaven were opened, that basically the crust begins to rupture and fracture and break. Plumes of magma start to invade into the area. That vaporizes a lot of water from the ocean, because if these magmas are coming in hitting the bottom of the ocean, they're over 1,000 degrees centigrade. I mean, they're really, really hot. And that's going to vaporize a bunch of water, which will then kind of cool and radiate some heat out into space and then come back down as rain. And that begins that 40 days and 40 nights of intense rainfall. Now, in Sunday school, we think the flood lasted 40 days and 40 nights. But reading the biblical text, the flood lasts over a year. The 40 days and 40 nights is just the first period of intense rainfall. So we've got a geological clue in Genesis about what's going on. The fountains of the great deep break, the windows of heaven were open, so we have something going on geologically to rupture the planet, and that seems to trigger this massive and unusual rain onto the earth.
So we're not talking about the old nursery rhyme where just all of a sudden water, rain comes down.
Right. Something
horribly wrong, if you want to look at it from the standpoint of the people who are there, is beginning to happen. That you're talking about the crust of the earth breaking open, and it's not just water now, you're talking about hot magma coming up.
Hot magma coming up, vaporizing parts of the ocean water, movements of continents at kilometers an hour, and a couple of miles per hour. Now, that doesn't seem very fast because you can walk, a couple of miles an hour. But if you're in the North American continent, moving at 4 miles an hour is really devastating. And that North American continent is moving this direction, and the African continent is moving towards the same point. And when those two things hit together, they end up colliding and crumpling and creating mountain belts. So one thing that we have to think about is that the geography of the world before the flood is very different from the geography that we have today. Today we've got North America and South America, and across the Atlantic you've got Europe and Africa and Asia. But the construction of the continents was very different. If this is North America now, and the equator's down over here, when the flood started, North America was actually down here somewhere. My home state of Virginia was in the southern hemisphere near the Tropic of Capricorn. That's a totally different view of the world. So things shifted, rotated, and moved and collided. The reason that we have the Appalachian Mountains and the Scandinavian Highlands and places like the Atlas Mountains in Morocco that are now found on 3 different continents all belong to a single mountain chain that was built when those continents collided. The idea of Pangaea, this large single supercontinent, wasn't the way that God created the world. That was actually a continent that existed and was formed during the flood. And then it broke apart and split away, and the continents moved again at several miles an hour away from one another as the Atlantic Ocean formed for the very first time. There was no Atlantic Ocean. This means that the Garden of Eden wasn't in the ancient Middle East, because the ancient Middle East isn't where it is today. So trying to find it by clues and saying, well, maybe the Tigris and Euphrates point us to where Eden is a fool's errand, because the purpose of the flood, once again, is to destroy the world completely and utterly. You can't find Eden because it's not there.
And that's what Peter tells us, that the Lord destroyed the world. In fact, even speaks of it as a world that was.
Yes.
So you're right. We couldn't find those things because they're no longer there.
Yeah, the geography is completely different. Other mountain belts happen a little bit later on. The Rocky Mountains out where you live are gorgeous and spectacular, and they're huge compared to the Appalachians that I grew up around. But the reason that the Appalachians are so small is because they were eroded during the flood, whereas the Rockies popped up towards the end of the flood and haven't suffered nearly as much erosion. When the Appalachians actually got crushed together along with the Atlas Mountains and the Scandinavian Highlands, they could have been as big as the Himalayas, but because the waters of the flood kept eroding them as they were coming up, they never made it quite that big. And as the continents move and the waters start to drain away as the flood ends a year after it started, you start to see the major geographic features of the world taking shape. We've got a Gulf of Mexico, we've got the Rocky Mountains, we've got the position of the continents getting close to where they are today. So our ideas about these things get really exciting because they hint us at a past that was so utterly and completely different than our present. I think one of the big distinctions between the conventional view of ancient ages and evolutionary theory and a biblical paradigm in which we're looking at anchor points of biblical history to help guide us is that we've got those as historical markers. Right? That the flood is an event that happened, but not just that the Bible said that it happened, but it also provides us with some understanding of how long it happened after creation. It gives us an idea of about how long it took between the flood and the birth of Abram, for example, which gets us to Israel's history and whatnot. So it's not like you can take the early chapters of Genesis, as some have tried, and said, well, it's just a primeval history that is detached from real history. It's not detached from real history. It's a continuous flow going back through time, and it's one that has singular events, and that's what Peter was helping to remind the Jews at the time that he was writing, that this is a singular event that was so utterly and completely different from everything else. That's why we know that Jesus' return is going to be an actual event that is completely and utterly different from everything else. History builds upon itself, and God does not forget the history that he has done, and he will use his prophets and his apostles to remind us of those histories.
Now let's meet my guest. Dr. Tim Cleary has a PhD in geology from Western Michigan University. He worked as an exploration geologist at Chevron, developing oil drilling prospects, and he's published many papers on aspects of the Rocky Mountains. Now, Tim has authored multiple college laboratory books and several books on dinosaurs in the Bible, and he's a geologist with the Institute for Creation Research. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, David. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. It is good to have you here in studio to talk about some of these things. Now, first off, tell me just a little bit about Institute for Creation Research.
Well, the Institute is started in 1970 by Henry Morris. He's our founder. And it's been going on for almost 50 years now. We have 9 scientists on our full-time staff, and with all different disciplines, from myself in geology to biology to genetics, a specialty of biology, nuclear physics, physics. We pretty much cover it all. And we're all doing research trying to show that God's word is true and that science really does confirm the Bible.
Well, and it really does, and we really appreciate your work there. Now, when we talk about various issues, the flood is one of those key events. Now, the flood explains so much about what we see in the geological record, doesn't it? As a geologist, what do you see?
Well, we see a record of rapid burial. To make a fossil, you got to bury things very, very quickly. And we see evidence of water deposits again and again and again, stacked on top of each other like bricks.
Well, okay, so tell me about the geologic column, because this is used as sort of the poster child for a 4.5 billion year history of Earth, and yet it does seem that in many places around the globe, you do find similar creatures in different rock layers. How do you interpret that?
Well, in my research, I'm looking at multiple continents, and every continent is showing this type of a record. But many times they leave out these marine fossils on the end.
Okay.
So on the right-hand side, you see throughout, mixed out, even when they're burying dinosaurs, you're burying marine animals right there with them. There's 5 species of sharks, for example, in the same rock formation that you find T-Rexes.
Really?
So there's marine fossils, more marine fossils actually than dinosaur bones in the rocks throughout the world. And we see the same pattern. The lowest most rocks contain mostly marine fossils, shallow marine fossils. As you work your way up, you get more animal types that start showing up from land that were probably in the swampy areas. And then as you go a little higher, you get to the dinosaurs, which probably also were in lowlands. And you go higher, you get the uplands animals, uplands type terrain, where you see different types of trees, different plants as you work your way up, just like you see different animals as you go up. So a lot of it has to do with the topography or the relief of the world. And it's the same pattern on every continent.
So if it's the same pattern on every continent, then wouldn't that speak to some global event?
Exactly, and that's the evidence I'm finding in the rocks, from continent to continent, not just North America, not just South America, but you put together multiple continents, and I'm now on my 4th continent, and they're all showing the exact same pattern.
Wow.
Not only are the fossils the same, but the pattern of the rocks and the fossils are exactly the same. The coverage is the same. You see increasing coverage from earliest stages of the flood to the later stages. You see the same point where they peak. You see the maximum coverage level on all the continents at the same time. And Then you see the evidence of more sediments offshore. As the water went down, you're going to push a lot of sediment offshore, all at the same time. So to me, the rocks cry out that you have a global flood. There's no other way to interpret it.
Okay, now break this down for us. What are we talking about when we say a global flood? If everyone's heard of the account of Noah's Ark, but most people have never thought about the implications. They've never thought about what that meant. If the earth was flooded, then what would we expect to find?
Well, you would expect to find lots of buried things, lots of buried animals, because God said he was going to judge the earth and destroy everything. Start over again with whatever animals, the pairs of animals on the ark, the people that got on the ark, and unfortunately only 8 people who believed Noah, believed God there was going to be a flood. But that's what he was starting over with. But the rest of what was left behind is exactly what we see. Thousands of feet of sediments, all laid down by water, all over the earth in the same general order. As the water went higher, covering the hills in each area, you see the same fossils everywhere. There truly is a global nature to the geologic column and to the rock record for the flood.
Okay, multiple times throughout the Bible, we read about truth. A lot of people believe now there is no absolute truth. It's whatever you want to be true is what the truth is. But the Bible speaks all over about the truth. Psalm 119, thy word is true from the beginning. John 17, thy word is truth. What about truth, and what about truth deniers?
Well, a lot of people deny what the Bible says. They try to twist the words of the Bible, or they try to reinterpret the Bible and say, well, these are just stories. You know, you don't supposed to take the first 11 chapters maybe as literal truth or literal history. But yet when you read through the text, it's written as history, just like the accounts of Joseph, the accounts of Abraham. There's no difference in the textual style from early Genesis to the end. And that's why the genealogies are in there. So all these so-and-so begat so-and-so, and so-and-so begat so-and-so,
Yes.
and the years in between are there for a reason, to show us that the earth is really not that old. What the accounts, if you add them up, ends up showing around 6,000 years.
6,000 years. Now, what I love is some of the research that you have been doing over the last several years, where you try to break down these strongholds of evolution by showing these mega sequences as flood depositions and how it reshaped the continents. Tell me about that.
Well, it's very compelling, I think, to me, to show that there was a real global flood, because we see the same patterns going on. The secular scientists have, used all these names, Cambrian through Cretaceous and Tertiary or Cenozoic, whatever you want to call it, and all their millions of years of time. They believe there were floods.
Okay.
They believe there were 6 kind of major floods.
Wow.
And that's what's listed on the far right-hand side of there, numbered 1 through 6.
Okay.
And so those are kind of larger than, they include some of these different time periods that they normally list, the Sauk, Tippecanoe, Kaskaskia, etc. Those are these major flood events that came in and flooded. So they see the evidence that there were floods.
Even secularists, you're saying, will admit that there was a lot of water deposition, that there were multiple floods that reshaped the world, but they say, well, multiple floods spread out over millions upon millions of years.
They throw the millions of years in there because they need that, so they can kind of have this fictional story of evolution.
Okay.
Animals changed, but yet the fossils don't show animals changing through time at all.
So what does the fossil record show?
The fossil record shows animals suddenly showing up in rocks. Below a certain level called the Cambrian, there's almost no fossils, just mostly maybe algae or something like that. But when you get to the Cambrian, there's an explosion of fossils, and it's still a mystery of secular science. Why is there an explosion? And then the next layer above, you see different fossils. The next layer above, different fossils. But we continually see fossils showing up without ancestors. They stay the same for a while, then they disappear. And as you're flooding these different levels around the world,
You're burying
you're
animals.
burying
underneath.
animals at different environmental elevations, different ecological
Interesting.
niches, we call them.
Okay. You've studied these things. You look at data all the time. Well, how can we use that data to interpret what we see around us? And how does that fit in with the biblical record?
And we find evidence for this in the direction of currents that are flowing over the surface of the earth. For example, in the rocks, if you've ever seen cross-bedded sandstone, it's sandstone that lies at an angle like this. That sandstone tells us which direction the current was moving that deposited that sand. If we look at these flow of currents over the surface of the earth and in all these different layers of rock, from the Cambrian all the way up to the top, we find out that it seems to be going the same way over wide areas of the earth. Like there's some kind of flow taking place that's different from anything we have today. Today we have a basin the sediments go into that basin from all sides, and we would see evidence of currents flowing into that basin. In the fossil record, what we see is the currents tend to ignore the basins. They tend to go right across the basins, and they tend to be looking at something much bigger than just a part of North America, for example. And in fact, the currents in North America and South America behave the same way, just to give you one example. So that, to me, suggests that in the development of the fossil record, we had processes going on that were bigger than anything we can imagine today. It doesn't say today's processes continued over a long period of time would have produced this. It says the only reasonable way to produce this is to have processes that are not going on the Earth today. When you look at the rocks themselves, you don't see evidence for the passage of a lot of time. And Dr. Brandon and I have been working on this for the last 15 years, just going through tens of thousands of meters of sediment, looking for evidence of the passage of time between the layers. And the evidence would be that the layers have been disrupted or resuspended or moved around by organisms or roots or whatever processes. Once you deposit a layer, if it's just sitting there for a year, say nothing of 100 years or 1,000 years, that layer is going to be affected by its environment.
So in the current process today, if we have some sediment that gets laid down, what you're saying is that there are processes going on that would radically change that layer.
Sure. Roots penetrate soil and move it around. Organisms, if it's, well, even above sea level, but below sea level, you have worms that live all over the bottom and other organisms, and they're burrowing constantly in the sediment. That's where they get their food. And so if you bring in a new supply of food for them, they're going to devour that, and they're going to mess up all the internal structure. So we look at these layers and we say, is the internal structure still there, or has it been disrupted by organisms, which equals time? Not a lot of time necessarily, but time. If you see no disruption, then you're going to have a hard time explaining that sediment in a long period of time.
And what did you find down in the fossil
We
records?
found tens of thousands of meters with no disruption whatsoever. One layer after layer after layer after layer. And we were looking at it in a centimeter scale. We were walking through thousands of meters of sediment, looking at centimeter level disruptions. And they're very difficult to find. You can find them once in a while, but not the kind that we would expect if there'd been the passage of a lot of time.
I used to take students into this particular region, and so there are rocks all over the place that contain fossils of other parts of those trees that we saw before. This rock right here is has got some fossils of the roots of those trees. You have the root structure here coming off of it, rootlets. There's a second root here with rootlets coming off of that. Rootlets coughing off in that direction. Yeah. So we've got roots. We've already seen bark. If you search around, you'll find all sorts of other kinds of parts of plants. Here, for example, we've got fossil leaves. They're not the same kind of plant as these. This is a different type of plant from that same forest. But in the process of, so you can see the shiny stuff is actually the actual leaf material.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
Preserved. And you got the leaves going in all sorts of different directions. So it's a different type of leaf, but you're getting pictures, if you wish, of not just the lycopods that made the floating mat, but all sorts of other kinds of plants.
Yeah.
When you put all this together, all sorts of plants of different types, you begin to get a picture of the ecosystem that these things were formed in.
So this is a picture of that antediluvian world.
Right.
And either the lushness or whatever that is, these are plants from that time.
Yes, yes.
What else do we know about that world from a plant perspective?
Well, there'd be some plants that were, I love these fossils, they look very much like fern fossils, or fern leaves. And they'd be laid out like you had put these plants into a book and had flattened them
Press
out,
them.
really, really flattened.
Yeah.
And these fossils, they're not bent, they're not broken, they're not even folded over on themselves, they're just as flat as could be.
How does that happen?
Well, that's an interesting question because, like this, is a plant, a fern here. How do we get the fern to be perfectly flat on a surface? It doesn't grow that way even. So what do? You dump mud on top of it and smash it down. You're going to get things folded.
Right.
You're going to get things broken. But if you look at these fossils, they're not that way. They're all spread out, just as flat as could be, and with great intricacy.
Okay, so
How
this
in
is
the
a mystery.
world did this happen?
It's a mystery.
And I didn't understand it for a while until actually I was in college and learned a little bit about plants and something called turgor pressure. We've all had plants in the house that we haven't watered in a while and we should have, and the little plant goes, "Ee."
Right.
And then you put water in the thing and it straightens back up again. It gets stiff. The reason for that is because plants are built differently than animals in a variety of ways. One is around each cell, which doesn't exist in an animal, is a cell wall. It's kind of a hard cubicle that the cell is in. And if the cell pulls in a bunch of water and swells up and pushes against the side of that cubicle, it stiffens the whole plant. If the cell shrinks because it's lost water, it pulls away from those cell walls,
And then
the
it
cell
droops.
walls get weak and it turns over. That turgor pressure is where the water comes in and stiffens the whole plant so it can straighten up. Turns out that you could, for example, take one of these leaves and break it off and toss it into water, and it won't do it immediately, but in time these leaves will flatten out, and then if it happens to get waterlogged and fall down to the bottom, it's going to be this very flat structure. Now, what happens if a dead leaf, it's already dead, falls off the tree and goes into the water? That never flattens out.
Why is that?
Because the cells have already died, the cells have burst, and turgor pressure doesn't work.
So that water does not move inside the cell.
So you can't take dead leaves and create these beautiful flat leaves.
So they had to be alive.
That these leaves have got to be alive at the time they're ripped off of their origin. They've got to be floated for a certain amount of time, for at least hours, in water, and then deposited in water to end up so flat as this. So we're now starting to get a picture of the process necessary to get the leaves to this state. We're destroying an ecosystem by water, biblical flood, carrying those plants over a great distance and depositing them into this kind of an environment like this. Then what kind of plants do we find? We find a strange set of plants. We were looking at these roots here, and these roots are hollow roots with hollow rootlets and hollow stems. These are trees that are only made of bark.
Yeah.
Very strange trees.
Yes.
The trees are designed, it seems, to actually float in water. This led Joachim Shevin in the early 80s to suggest that the coal plants were actually part of a floating forest that existed on a large body of water before the flood, and that they were destroyed in the flood. Now, I didn't know anything about his particular theory. I was kind of interested in another issue, which is not just the fossil, not just the trees, but all the fossil plants. Because in the fossil record, it turns out that when I went through school, learning about paleontology, about fossils, I was told by evolutionists the order of the fossils in the record corresponds to evolution.
Right.
Okay. And so one of the first things I did when I had the opportunity was test that hypothesis. What is the order predicted by evolution, and what is the order that you actually find in the fossil record? Specifically of when the order that the kingdoms come in, the order that the phyla come in, the order that the classes come in, the order that the orders come in. And I found that for shallow marine invertebrates, which is 95% of the fossil record, the record doesn't correspond. Major groups of organisms don't appear in the fossil record in the order evolution predicts. 95% of the time, there's no correlation. So in science, usually when we say we've explained 95%, no need to go any further, we've explained enough. But for a while, I was wondering about that other 5%.
Yeah.
What about the ones that actually do, and what actually is in the right order? The things that turn out to be in the right order, the best example, if I was an evolutionist, I'd jump on the plants. The major groups of plants, 12 of the 13 are in exactly the order evolution predicts.
Order in the fossil record.
In the fossil record. They come into the fossil record as groups of plants in the order evolution would say they should come if they arose by evolution. So I became intrigued with that. What could explain this in terms of a flood? I'm not believing in evolution. How do I get that order? And I remembered as a kid having an experience on a quaking bog, which is a mat of vegetation that grows over water.
Okay.
And I was 12 years old at the time. It's really cool. We got out of the car, we walked through the forest, and man, we were walking up the steep paths and down, and all up and down, and all of a sudden, the path got really flat. It was a sudden transition from, but still the same woods, same trees, all that sort of thing, but very, very flat. We walked down about 100 feet into this flat stuff. The guy that was with us said, okay, now everyone grab hands. So there were 12 or 13 of us there. We all grabbed hands. Like, what in the world is this guy doing? And he says, okay, now we got to get this all in sync. Everybody's got to jump up and down at the same time. Like, what is he doing? So it took quite a while to get 13 people to jump up at the same time and land at the same time. So like big jump rope, I guess. But when we got into sync, I realized I hit the ground and the ground moved. The ground went down, and when I went up, I pushed off. The ground continued to go down. When I went up, I came back down. The ground was on its way up, and I met it. And I realized we're pushing the ground up and down.
It's bouncing.
We're in a circle, so it was creating basically a wave. If you throw something into water and you see those round waves move away from it, every time we pushed down and then came up, that hump we're produced would move out from us like a wave through water, through the ground, okay? And as it did, these plants, which were standing up straight, would sway as it moved, and it got to trees, and the trees would move. And I realized, as we're continuing to move up and down, we got these concentric circles, we must be on water.
Right.
This must be a forest sitting right on top of water.
Maybe.
It's called a quaking bog. If you look at a quaking bog, it's something that grows away from the shore, grows out into open water. And there are certain types of plants which go out first, which are little guys, and then there are bigger plants that grow after them, and bigger ones, and they get thicker and thicker layer of peat there that they're growing on. We continued that walk from there. As we went out towards the center of what I didn't know at that time was actually a lake, it got thinner and thinner. So you didn't need the whole group. You could individually, you could create these waves. Get a little bit further and you realize each step was pressing the ground down. It's like,
that'd be weird.
I'm a little concerned about this.
Yeah.
And I realized at some point, this is a little too mushy. I'm a bipedal organism. I don't think it's good for me to be in this position. So I got on my hands and knees to spread my weight out, and even my elbows are get out further. And the trees are gone, and now we're talking about shorter bushes, tall bush cranberries. Then we got into short bush cranberries and blueberries and this sort of thing. By now, I am flat on. I'm afraid I'm going to go through, and I could never find my way back up. Eventually I got to where I'm not going to go any further. This is getting thinner, open water out there. This is something that grows out over water, small plants to large plants. And you can actually float entire forests. So I realized when I look back at the fossil record, what if you had a huge floating forest, not growing out over the land, but actually floating on the ocean. And that these various strange plants that we have in the fossil record, these hollow trees that are designed to be light enough to float, what if they make up the center portion, the old portion of the forest, and then you have smaller plants designed to grow out at concentric circles away from it. And I realized that if there was such a thing before the flood waters with the big waves would begin to destroy the forest from the outside in. It would first destroy the little guys, and then the bigger ones, and the bigger ones, and finally destroy the center portion with the big trees. And what that would show underneath the forest, at the bottom here, is you'd first have the little plants, and then the bigger plants, and the bigger plants.
And you'd have that order.
And so when you look at the fossil record of the plants, those 13 groups of plants, it turns out two things. Their design is such that as you go up the column, they're more and more independent of standing water. The first ones you get need standing water to reproduce. They actually have sperm and eggs that swim towards each other. And as you go up, you get to drier plants. You also go from small plants to big plants. And the thing that always mystified me about the plants, you find them in marine sediments mixed with marine organisms. Like, why in the world are plants? I asked my professors, why in the world are plants found with marine organisms? Well, they must have floated down the rivers and the creeks and ended up in the ocean. I said, I'm having a hard time understanding how that works.
Maybe they were there in the beginning.
But if in fact it's a marine system of a whole, I'm going to suggest a continent-sized floating forest that existed the size of North America, let's say, floating on the ocean before the flood, with all these plants that seem so weird to us. They're mostly extinct today. And thinking about it, if the flood destroyed it, there's no way that forest could regrow on the oceans following the flood, because they're too uneven. It's too choppy. So once it's destroyed, it's destroyed. So the reason that most of these plants are extinct is because that ecosystem could never rebuild itself. And that began a series of investigations on my part to say, if that ecosystem was unusual before the flood, is it possible there are others? And began to realize that just about everywhere I turned, I'm looking at groups of organisms that are unique. Oh, and by the way, the fun thing about the floating forest that I didn't realize right away, I didn't think about the animals at first, because I was trying to explain the fossil record of the plants. And then I thought, wait a minute, what about the animals? And I remembered crawling around on that mat, thinking, what kind of organisms would God create that would be specially designed for that mat? I don't think bipedal organisms are best designed. I think we need organisms that can spread their weight out, that sit low to the ground. And in fact, maybe at the edge of this, where it's much too thin for anything to be on top of it, what if you had an animal that could float, buoy its body up by water, but actually have little legs that it could run around on this? That would be perfectly designed for it. Now, if the flood destroyed the forest from the outside in, it's going to bury these animals in that order. So you'd expect fish to be outside where the forest isn't. On the edge of the forest, you're going to have maybe fishopods, fish that can actually swim, but they've got these funny little legs that can run around on this thin mat that nothing else could run around on. And then further in, you'd have very broad, which you could potentially have very large, but broadly distributed weight of an amphibian, which what we find is labyrinthodon amphibians, which are really big but low-lying and their weight spread. And so you'd have a sequence of animals that corresponds to the sequence of plants. And all of a sudden, we've explained the fossil record of what looks like evolution of fish to fishopods to amphibians to pure land animals. but in fact is explained by the destruction of this floating forest.
Yes. So we have an ecosystem, first of all, looking at plants, and a very strange one for us today, but a big floating continent of forest, but it has all kinds of plants in it. And that then corresponds to an ecosystem of animals, as you're just saying. Well, that would mean that we have these unique communities then that are part of this antediluvian world.
Yeah, we have a dinosaur community, for example. So there's a special set of animals and plants that make up a biome, an ecosystem made of both plants and animals, a huge biome that's unique, that's different from all the others.
Kurt, this sounds like this antediluvian world here was remarkable. I mean, it was lush, it had all of these biomes. That's a reflection of the creation, even though it's now past the period of the fall.
Yeah, what I see as I've discovered more and more biomes is I'm understanding that this world before the flood was more diverse than the present world. It's we have a God who, as the triune God, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, who loves variety, and he just creates a variety of things. So I'm beginning to understand that he's probably created not just one continent before the flood, but multiple continents, each continent having a different biome. And just all sorts of really cool biomes that we just don't have today. One of them is this floating forest, which is certainly unique.
Yeah.
But I've speculated on some others, like a hot spring biome with bacterial reefs. Reefs not of corals and that sort of thing, but of bacteria, of all things. It's just wild things. So the world seems to be one of great variety. And what happened in this incredible event of the flood is it seems to have picked up entire biomes and carried them great distances and then buried them together, so that you get the plants and the animals that live together buried together.
Right.
So you end up with these sequential layers with different biomes, not different times in Earth history with different plants and animals, but you're actually looking at different places on the same world. So go through a traditional natural history museum and you're getting these dioramas of supposedly different times in Earth history. No, just rethink it. This is a different place on that world that existed before the flood, the world that then was, that being overflowed with water perished. So that when you go into the various rooms of such museums and see these different snapshots of different places in the world, a travelogue of the world that existed at the time of Noah, not a history of the earth.
As you just said, that just is so reflective of a God who is so not only creative, but even within his own nature, bears this diversity and yet unity, all bound up in these wonderful biomes. What a great picture. Steve and I saw these nautiloid fossils in the Grand Canyon. How do they fit in that overall fossil record?
Well, one of the things I like about natural history museums is they often have dioramas like this, which lay out a whole series of different ecosystems and communities. And in this one, you've got Cambrian and Ordovician and a whole bunch of those weird terms that are in there. And your nautiloids are in here somewhere, right? They were in the Grand Canyon. And so what we're seeing with these is the community structure, the community makeup. What are the animals, what are the plants that are found in some of those layers? And in the Grand Canyon, as well as everywhere else, those layers are stacked on one another in order to form the fossil record of the geological column.
Okay.
And what the fossil record is really those stacks of layers with the communities in them. And we use the fossils like the Post-it notes to figure out where exactly we might happen to be in those layered communities. So the trick is, the real data are these stacks of rocks that have fossils in them. The interpretation is then how those stacks of rocks came to exist, and why is it that some communities of animals in these rocks look the same or different from ones that are below. these dioramas show us what each of those individual communities would have looked like. And from a creation perspective, what I like about this is it gets us the idea of what if we were transitioning from deeper water communities to progressively more and more shallow communities as we go through, because one of the big pictures that we have in the fossil record is that the lower units are dominated by marine organisms, by shells, clams, trilobites, things like that. The higher that you get up, the more terrestrial organisms start showing up. It's as if, you know, all the stuff in the ocean is being destroyed, and then eventually the stuff on land starts getting destroyed too. And then, you know, sooner or later you get to the end of the flood, and other things are going on after the flood. But big picture-wise, we have this overall shift from lots and lots of marine organisms to a transition to some terrestrial to mostly terrestrial, and then the flood is probably done. So one of the things that we can see here is that we've got communities. Right here, we have the Cambrian community, and that is on this side. If you want to think about the Grand Canyon, take the Grand Canyon, tip it sideways.
Okay.
So you tipped everything sideways. Here's the Great Unconformity.
All right.
Back over here, those are the granites and the non-fossil bearing rocks. The Great Unconformity, and then the first thing that we find is this community that has been pulled up and deposited and thrust over the continent and deposited in what's now Arizona. And inside that are things like these predatory critters called Anomalocaris. You've got trilobites. There are sponge-like creatures down over here. There's little echinoderms. There's a functional community there. As we move closer to the shore, think of that as a bit of a deep water environment. Moving a little bit closer to the shore, we start getting into a shallow carbonate reef. Okay, and that carbonate reef has got some corals in it. It's got a group of brachiopods. Nautiloids start showing up. Now, they're not the same nautiloids you see in Grand Canyon, but the Grand Canyon does have some other nautiloids. That's the Ordovician group. As we keep moving closer and closer towards shore, we're picking up more and more organisms. So again, more sea scorpions in this case start showing up. We end up with more nautiloids, fish of wide and very odd variety. And as we come closer still, we keep getting just a little bit closer to shore until eventually, once we get into the Mississippian, which for the Grand Canyon has got the nautiloids, but on the other side of the country, when you're in the Appalachians, this is the coal-bearing units. Explaining those coal beds is an interesting trick, because the plants are not like pines and oaks and things like that we see. They're very, very odd, different, even somewhat cylindrical and hollow plants. Some creationists think that this might actually represent a forest that was floating out as kind of a subcontinent-sized mat of vegetation to explain the types of plants that we see making up those coal beds. So by the time we get to something like the Mississippian, we're right near the shore or on the shore and getting terrestrial environments. We're starting to get terrestrial organisms. By the time we're in the Mississippian, we're starting to see amphibians. Okay. But curiously, the first evidence that we have of the amphibians isn't the bodies, it's the trackways. And then we start seeing the amphibians themselves. So it looks like they were running away from something, but they get caught and they get buried, and we transition over and we get into the Pennsylvanian, and in this we start seeing the very first reptiles. Again, thinking kind of from the bottom up, what's finally getting buried, we're getting more and more progressive towards the shore, right, towards the land environments. And once we get past this and in through what's called the Permian, the next group after this that continues on would be the Mesozoic, with the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous, right? The age of dinosaurs. Very terrestrial. There's still marine stuff going on because the waves of the flood are still taking the marine organisms and pushing them onto the continent. But by this time, you're also flooding so much of the continent that the terrestrial animals are being captured and buried and dragged. As we go through this whole thing, and we've got community after community after community after community, right? My evolutionary colleagues look at these as communities over time. For the creationists, though, this isn't communities over time. These are all living at the same time. They're just not living in the same place. And the order that we have in the rock record, from the Great Unconformity on up, shows us a reflection of ecosystems that are being sequentially buried that happen to live at the same time. So this diorama is great because it does take that vertical section of rock and it tips it on its side, exactly how a creationist would look at this, as going deep water, to
Yes,
shallow water
right.
to the land. And this, I think, is one of the ways that the creationists can take a look at the fossil record, start making testable hypotheses and predictions about what we should find, and make sense of otherwise what seems to be a fairly curious set of data.
So both paradigms are looking at the same fossil record.
Yeah.
The data is the same for both of them.
Yeah. And we're trying to interpret those data in the way that we best can and see which one of these paradigms makes the most sense out of the data. Effectively, this wall right here takes what we just walked through, right, and it takes it vertical, because the reality is in the rocks. That's where you find it.
Yeah, this is
And
what we saw in the canyon.
yeah, the Grand Canyon. Here's the rocks of the continent. Right here are those granites and metamorphic rocks. The black is the great unconformity. And then you've got your Cambrian, your Ordovician, your Silurian, your Devonian, and on and up the rock column we go. So really what we're recognizing is that we have these patterns of rocks. Inside those rocks are certain types of fossils. And both paradigms are seeking to come about with an explanation that makes the best sense of all the data. So Del, when you were in the Grand Canyon, you were looking at rocks from this unit.
Okay.
And we call this, you can see at the top there, the Paleozoic rocks. The Paleozoic means ancient life. So in an old Earth view, this is kind of the older life forms of things that are primitive, so to speak. Then above that is another unit. So this is the Paleozoic. Above the Paleozoic is what's called the Mesozoic. It means middle life, and it has the more familiar Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous rocks. So all those dinosaurs that are here in the museum are coming from those rock layers, and those rock layers are located on top of and not in the Grand Canyon, so you didn't see them there.
And when you add up the rocks like I'm doing, I'm going around the globe, put in oil well data, put in seismic data that connects to oil wells, anywhere I can get a geologic column. So I can get whatever, if you were to drill a well right here, all the way to the crust, I put those rocks in our database.
Okay.
And you get enough, I've got almost 2,000 points now on several continents. And when you put all those together, you see a compelling picture of how the flood progressed.
Let's look at these, the Salt, the Tippecanoe, and the Cascade. Where do you see that in the flood?
Okay, now-
How long do you think it took?
I think those might have been within the first 40 days of the flood. The Bible talks about day 40, the ark starts to float.
Yes.
And so the first 40 days, it may be that we're just flooding shallow seas.
Okay.
And what we see in those three sequences is just marine fossils.
Huh.
There's almost no land animals, there's almost no coal evidence of land plants at all. It isn't until the next sequence that we see land animals and coal suddenly show up. So
Interesting.
that might be the first 40 days because the ark, the Bible tells us, started to float on day 40. So then we know you're flooding the land.
Okay. All right. Talk about tsunamis for a second and the catastrophic effects that we see during sudden things that happen here on Earth today.
Right. Today we see very sudden movements of faults. We see offsets of faults that are just tens of feet or maybe just a few, covering a few hundred miles. And we create tsunamis like we see that devastate things. But during the flood, these things would have been 8-10 times bigger.
Wow.
You know, nothing that we can really even fathom, because you're going to have real rapid movement at a very short time scale. Tremendous amounts of tsunamis, almost to the point where John Baumgartner has modeled these out in his computer models of the globes. You almost have continuous staining waves of water on the continents because you have so many tsunamis being generated by this rapid movement of the plates.
All right, now at this point, I'm going to turn this over to you, and I want you to take us through some of the core drill information that you have done. As an oil geologist, you have studied the data, and people drill wells all over the world.
All over the world.
So you have a lot of data points.
This is actually showing the very first, what I call the flood layer.
Okay.
There might have been some earlier flood rocks in a few selected locations, but this is the first extensive layer. And it's also the first layer that shows a lot of fossils. This is
Okay.
the Cambrian explosion. This is the bottom of the Sauk. And so you see this yellow is one continuous blanket sand.
Yes.
And blanket sands are a mystery today to the psycho to explain. How do you get a sand that covers that much area? One layer. Even if they try to say it took millions of years of a river, but you wouldn't, in many places it's only 10 foot thick or 20 foot thick.
Okay.
Others it's maybe 100 or more, but it's very, very thin. It's almost like it was laid down like a blanket. And we see as creationists, as flood believing scientists, we see that this is evidence of these tsunami waves coming in, going across a broad, flat area of the continent. Most of North America was pretty flat. And so it spread this big layer across, and on top of that was shale and limestone, but this is the bottommost layer.
So this was one of the first things to be buried right at the start of the
One
flood.
of the very first deposits, right, that buried
Okay.
animals. But again, this is compelling because it's so massive. It covers
Yes.
such a large area. This is not a trivial thing. And again, the secular scientists can explain these types of features. If we go up in the rocks, we can actually see these, from Michigan all the way down to Grand Canyon. It's the same rock layer across that
Wow.
whole area, all the way up to Alaska and across into Greenland.
Okay.
And it goes on to multiple continents, in fact. But we'll stick with North America. If you jump up a couple layers, this is blue, represents a limestone. So this is the Redwall limestone down in Grand Canyon down here
Yeah.
in Arizona, but it extends all the way to Michigan as well. It extends all the way up to Canada through Montana, all the way up to Alaska.
Wow.
There's a little bit of sand in there in yellow, but that's one, again, blanket limestone layer that
Okay.
covers this huge area. How do you explain these massive layers of the same lithology, the same rock type, that far? Even if you believe in the millions of years, things are going to change.
Yes.
You wouldn't get the same layers. You wouldn't get the same layer of sand, the same layer of limestone. And on top of this, again, we get more and more and more rocks. And so what we see in those early sequences, the Sauk, Tippecanoe, Kaskaskia we talked about earlier, is all marine things. And so I believe that much of North America was a shallow sea.
Okay.
But if you go to Africa, you go to South America, you see almost no coverage at all in these first three sequences.
Okay.
Those areas might have been a little higher ground.
Oh,
And
I
so they
got
weren't
you.
flooded yet
And
until
so
later in the flood.
First things flooded would
Were-
expect it to be
would be
the
shallow
sea,
seas,
the
right.
pre-flood sea areas with marine creatures.
Yeah, and a lot of those areas might have only been 200 feet of water. A
Okay.
lot of it was on the continents,
Okay.
but it might have been a very shallow, really beautiful sea with lots of corals and all these things that we see.
Yeah.
And it might have been a beautiful sight to see, but those areas were flooded. There's almost no land animals at this point. And this might have been the first 40 days.
Okay.
Then the flood starts to flood. We see all these marine critters as you go along.
Yeah.
And you look at the total thickness in North America, it's really thick in the east where you see the green.
Mm-hmm.
It's over 3 kilometers thick, which is about 2 miles to most people that don't know metric. And over here, again, it's the same way. But down the middle of the country, it's very thin. Those darker colors mean you're probably just a few tens of feet or not existing at all. So there's no
Okay.
flooding over parts of the world at this point in the flood.
Because these may have been,
May have been dry
slightly
land,
dry.
a little drier land,
Okay,
a little higher elevation, we
yeah.
weren't flooding them.
Yeah. Okay.
But then the Bible talks about day 40 to day 150. The waters went higher and higher and higher. And eventually reached the highest point, we believe, on day 150. And you can read in the text, the waters increased, the waters prevailed. They increased greatly, prevailed exceedingly. So if you read through that straightforward, you see God's telling us the water got higher, and then it went higher, then it went higher yet.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what the rocks show. As you go to the Absarica, you start to see coal seams. You start to see
Okay.
the waves get bigger, and you see a whole new ocean crust starts to form. This is
Oh.
when catastrophic plate tectonics really took off.
Okay.
And you have massive subduction all over the earth, all over the Pacific Ocean, forming massive amounts of ocean crust. And as you make ocean crust, it's hot. Like a hot air balloon, it pushes up. So as you push up more new ocean crust, it's going to push more water onto the land. So those tsunami waves are going to start going higher.
Okay.
And sure enough, we now see coal seams, and we see sedimentation coming in from the west
Yeah.
because of that subduction over 3 kilometers thick in the American West, which before, some of that was still high and dry. So now we start to see animals that lived on land start to get flooded. But they're still mixing in with marine animals. We see the first major coal seams showing up, mostly these lycopod coals,
Okay.
swamp areas along the coasts.
Like a swampy area. Okay.
And we see these coal seams, as I mentioned. We see flooding taking place. And as you go higher, this, I believe, is the high point of the flood. Every continent shows this same high point. North America, South America, Africa, even Europe seems to show the same high point. But now you see more sediment coming in from the west. And you see a couple little remnants up there in Canada, in Hudson Bay.
Yeah.
Those little blue dots.
Right.
Those little blue dots, to me, are very, very important because they're showing that there was sediment that was continuous across that. But what does the Bible tell us, David? The high point of the water went 15 cubits.
Upwards did it prevail.
Upwards of 15
That's
cubits.
right.
So if that was the highest point in what's now Canada, you only went 15 cubits, you don't have a lot of room to leave a lot of sediment.
Okay.
So you're only going to leave maybe 5, 10 feet of sediment,
Yeah.
and in some cases maybe a little bit more. And so after the flood, it's been now 4,500 years since the flood, you're going to erode those few 5, 2,
Sure.
3 feet away. And so you're going to have barren crystalline rock there, and that's what we see today. That's one of the
Really?
reasons why the secular scientists think it didn't flood everything, because they see areas of crystalline rock.
Okay.
But yet they forget there's remnants
Uh-huh.
of that flooding that took place. So that
Yes.
shows me that the water went over the top, but it just didn't leave a lot behind. And the Bible
Interesting.
explains exactly why.
Wow.
So as you go higher, though, you start mixing marine and land, marine and land, marine and land. As you go along, you see the dinosaurs mixed with sharks, like I mentioned, dinosaurs and T-Rexes with sharks.
Okay.
All these marine critters and clams, marine clams mixed with dinosaurs. Always mixing things, pushing these marine animals all the way into Kansas. You've dug dinosaurs and animals
Absolutely.
in Kansas. You see a lot of marine animals there as well.
You do. You see things like tylosaurs and giant 60-foot long. Yeah, absolutely.
And as only the Bible does tell us, the water went down. Started on day 150, it started to go down, I think, to about day 314, but yet they didn't get off the ark yet
Okay.
because they had to wait for things to grow. There's nothing for the animals to eat, so they had to stay on the ark, even though the water had receded. So that's why I don't go the full year here. I'm going to go to 314.
Okay.
But it talks in the text again. It says the water is assuaged in the King James. That means it kind of went back and forth, and that's what we see with tsunami waves. So it even kind of describes the tsunami activity as it's going down. And what happened is the bottom of the ocean started to cool.
Okay.
As things cool, they sink. So the crust of the ocean, as it was being produced, was hot, pushed up, flooded the land. As the ocean started to cool now, when you stop the plate motion, things start to cool and slow down. It pulls the water off, and God also says He made a wind to pass over the earth to push the water off as well. And so tremendous amounts of water and sediment and mud were stripped off the continents and pushed into the offshore areas, including our own Gulf of Mexico.
Okay.
So the waters returned from off the earth continually at the end of 150 days. So the high point, again, he reminds us, was 150 days into the flood, and then the water took a long time to go down. Floods today take a long time to go down.
That's true.
They don't just go away. And this is that story of the ocean crust sinking and pulling it down. So all that new ocean crust, especially the blue and green areas, the earlier forming crust, was starting to sink. And that's where we see the deepest oceans even today.
Okay.
So here's the Tejas, which is the draining water. We see all that thick area in the Gulf.
So
all
this
that
was
green,
after the high point. This
after
is the
high
draining
point.
water.
You're coming down and everything's going offshore. So you see all the areas.
Oh, yeah.
There's less on the continent, but the mountains also pop up at this point. So the Rockies come up and they shed a lot of sediment.
Yep.
Tremendous amounts of sediment that were over the tops of the Rockies all got stripped off and put out in the Great Plains. And much of that ended up in the Gulf.
Okay.
And that's where we find tens of thousands of feet of Tejas or Cenozoic sediments. And
Wow.
we find a lot of our oil wells are drilled into those sediments today.
Okay.
And the deepest part out there is it's got a sand. There's a big sand called the Whopper Sand,
Uh-huh.
which I've done some research on. That was discovered in 2005 in over 7,000 feet of water, 200 miles offshore.
Wow.
There's a 1,000-foot thick sand that covers the central part of the Gulf,
Okay.
which nobody predicted, but yet that seems to fit in really well with the initial draining of the floodwaters as it went off into the Gulf. So much material went off under high energy, just like water pouring off a parking lot. The highest energy is going to go out there first and push that sand way out in the Gulf, and then later it became more and more clay because less energy.
But then on top of the Mesozoic, there's even more rocks. And those are the Cenozoic, means the recent life, and it's called that because it typically has mammals and birds and other things that are more familiar to the world that we live in right now.
Would humans be found then in that top layer?
Yeah, within the rock record, the only place where human fossils are found are actually at the very, very top of the Cenozoic. Now, I have to be honest, from a young Earth creation perspective, my expectation would be that there would be some humans in the flood rocks, because the way I look at things, the Paleozoic are made during the flood, the Mesozoic rocks with the dinosaurs are made during the flood, right? Just other ecosystems that are being destroyed. And then the Cenozoic is probably representing the world that reestablishes itself when the flood is over. So one of the curious things that we find in the Cenozoic is, we've got all of these mammals of different kinds, and early horses, early deer, whales, things like that. And the humans aren't found until the very top. That could be because the humans don't actually go out from the spreading point until much later on. Now, why they're not found in the flood rocks is a more difficult problem for young Earth creationists. It's one of those data points that doesn't seem to cut our way, at least at first blush. Creationists have a variety of different ways in which they might address that. Maybe the human population wasn't very large. Maybe it was concentrated in certain areas that didn't lend themselves to fossilization. Or maybe people, being clever, were able to avoid most of the initial destruction of the flood that built all of this. And most of the next stuff, and so maybe people were capable of escaping. I don't know that any one of those solves it. Maybe a combination does, or maybe we need, other bright minds to come through and give us some ideas, because within science, there's so much we don't know. I mean, whether you're an evolutionist or a creationist, there's so much that we don't know that, I'm itching for more colleagues so that I can have fun conversations.
Right. So we're still trying to answer some of those questions on both paradigms. Is that correct?
Yeah, the thing about science is every answer that you get leads you to another 2 or 3 or 4 questions. It's not even just, I got that answer, I got one more question. Usually you have a couple more. And so, discovery is something that is exciting. Discovery is something that's fun. It's why people go out and collect dinosaur bones. And once they find out, okay, this is what a T-Rex is, but then they start asking, well, how come it's built this way? Or what do you do with the arms? Or how come the head's so big? Or why is the tail this long? Right? Once you get an idea of something overall, but then you get into the more specific questions, in every discipline, things get more interesting when you start, really getting down in the weeds of the details. And that's where things get fun.
Yeah.
Most people have never heard of the Ashley phosphate beds of South Carolina, which is a shame because it is the best piece of evidence to ever exist currently that man has lived alongside of dinosaurs, without question. The Ashley phosphate bed is the largest graveyard ever found. This information has been forgotten by the sands of time, but I am going to bring it back. Today, the Ashley phosphate bed is mined for its high quantities of phosphate, which is being used for fertilizer, so there is great money to be made. These sedimentary layers are huge, covering large portions of the Carolinas and extending into Florida all the way up into Canada. World-famous geologist at the time, Louis Agassiz, described the phosphate beds as the greatest graveyard he had ever known. The phosphate beds are so full of bones that it is believed by scientists that the phosphate itself is made from bone. So, if the Ashley phosphate bed is loaded with such an incredible amount of fossils as to cause the leading geologist and zoologist of his day to call them the greatest graveyard he had ever known, you should ask yourself, why has zero mention of this ever been brought up? The fossils completely ravaged the evolutionary timeline. That's why. Remember, if the geologic column is out of place, even in one area on Earth, then it falsifies the theory of evolution, and that the layers form slowly and that they represent time. Well, when you look at this one place where there's an 18-inch thick layer, you will see why it's suppressed. In it are rare fossils of everything from whales and porpoises, fish, sharks, megalodon shark, toads, crocodiles, alligators, turtles, rabbits, monkeys, horses, camels, elephants, mammoth, mastodon, rhinoceroses, giant sloth, muskrats, deer, pig, dogs, hadrosaur dinosaurs, iguanodon dinosaurs, plesiosauruses, ichthyosaurs, and human bones, teeth, and artifacts, all within the same layer. Professor S.F. Holmes, the paleontologist and curator of the College of Charleston's National History Museum, described the fossil graveyard in a report to the Academy of Natural Sciences. He stated, "Remains of the hog, the horse, and other animals of recent date, together with human bones mingled in with the bones of mastodon and extinct giant lizards." And this is on record. The occurrence of a hadrosaur dinosaur remains in the Ashley phosphate beds has not been dealt with in the secular science literature really at all. Only 2 sources exist. They have kept it silent, which is typical. The sad part is, when they first uncovered the relics of the human bone, they immediately became afraid. They, without hesitation, considered their jobs to be at a loss, so they said that the bone was out of place to one another, so they immediately threw it in the river to be erased from history and hidden from all view. They knew that such a find would cause them to either probably lose their jobs or their grant funding. And this is all the way back in the late 1800s. They were still in fear of the government from evolutionary dogma, as Darwin's theory had now taken hold. The scientists who studied this knew exactly what they had found. This is why their deep concern for finding such anomalies. Professor of Geology and Paleontology F.S. Holmes believed in the conventional evolutionary sequence. So he knew full well that humans and dinosaurs should not be found in the same layer, In fact, he wrote, "Not long after finding the above-named relics of human workmanship and engaged in our usual visits to the Ashley bed, a bone was found projecting from the bluff. Immediately in contact with the surface of the stormy stratum, we pulled it out and behold, a human bone. Without hesitation, it was condemned an accidental occupant of quarters to which had no right, geologically, and so we threw it into the river. Alas, we have lived to regret our temerity and rashness. A year later, a lower jawbone with teeth was taken from the same bed, and now we have it in the cabinet." After the news became public, I guess Holmes saw no reasons to cower from his discovery anymore, as Holmes portrayed a dinosaur with a man on the cover of his own book. Evolutionists have admitted that if dinosaurs are ever found with humans, then they would admit that the Noah's flood was real and that man did live alongside of dinosaurs, and that the biblical timeline is true. Because this evidence would validate that the Earth is young and that they had been lied to about our ancient history, there is no rescuing device for them either, because the Ashley phosphate beds had no layers to them. All of the fossils are mixed together in one huge pool of bones, 18 inches thick, covering 200 miles, with no layers found anywhere. The experts who spent considerable time excavating in the phosphate beds have said that there are no layers, and not even a remote resemblance of a layer. It is all one graveyard. You can learn more about the Ashley phosphate bed in a book called Man, Dinosaur, and Mammals Together, written by the late geologist John Watson, available at Mount Blanco Fossil Museum.
All right, so if we were to look at the sequences once more, what do we see? What's the very latest? What's the last?
The last one was the Teos, which I think flew through kind of fast. That's the Cenozoic, whatever you want to call it. You know, there's a bunch of different names in geology.
And that's where we find mammals.
That's where we find most of the mammals. We find mammals earlier, but we find the big mammals in the Cenozoic.
Okay.
And I think that's because they were living at the highest elevation.
Yeah.
And that's probably where most of the humans were living in the pre-flood world as well. Early on, you would see, you know, the earliest part of the flood didn't really flood the land because we don't see land animals. We don't see coal.
Okay.
We just see marine animals. And so it appears that the earlier part of the flood, maybe there wasn't enough seafloor made yet through the runaway subduction or the catastrophic plate tectonics activity. So you weren't pushing the waves high enough to flood the land.
Okay.
But you're burying a lot of marine critters.
A lot of marine critters.
A lot of tsunami waves. And as you made more seafloor, you push the water up higher, so it goes up and starts to flood.
Okay.
What I call, in North America anyway, there's a little peninsula of land I call Dinosaur Peninsula.
Yeah.
But that would be the lowland areas.
Okay.
So you start to get the first coal seams, the first land animals, mixed in with marine animals. And then as the water went higher yet, you get to the Zuni, you went over the top, and you left those little remnants behind. But that's when you strip off everything right down to the crust.
Wow.
And all the mammals then got buried on top of the dinosaurs as the water kind of changed direction.
Okay.
And then everything shifted to go down, and you have what's left is this perfect record of the flood on every continent. Start with the marine animals, you know, to the lowlands areas, to the upland areas. And the flood explains it perfectly, in the perfect order that we see, without any transitional fossils whatsoever, because there weren't any.
Wow. That is so encouraging. Thank you, Dr. Clary, for
Thank
joining
you.
us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
Well, again, the fossil record stands today as one of the main lines of evidentiary support for the theory of evolution, that organisms have evolved over long periods of time from simple to complex forms. And this proof comes from the fact that fossils are typically found below or above other types of fossils. However, if we interpret this sorting from within the biblical worldview, what we believed happened is that this sorting of fossils merely represents the destruction of successive life zones during the flood, the destruction of successive habitats as the floodwaters rose. We have to understand that different plants and animals live in different habitats on the earth, and that these different habitats are different from one another, largely based on the difference in the temperature and the amount of water in that area, factors which are directly related to elevation. So these different habitats, by and large, are related to the different elevations. And as the floodwaters rose, it's sequentially destroyed habitats one after the other, leading to what you see as as the fossil record that we see today. Well, let me show you one other map. Another map of I showed you this map before that shows the layers of the fossil record that are on the surface of North America. Okay. And next to this map, I want to show you another map, and that's the map of the biomes in North America. Biomes is a fancy word for the different habitats in North America, like the Great Plains and your tundras and tropical forest, etc. The map that you see here is the layers of the fossil record that are on the surface in North America, and I'm going to put next to that a map that shows where the present day habitats in North America are, and I want you to see just how eerily similar those are. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what you're looking at. The fossil record is not a record of the history of life on Earth over hundreds of millions of years. It's not a record or proof that the Earth is older than the Bible says it is. It's unmistakable proof of a global scale flood that was brought by God due to the corruption on the Earth in those days.